Fisher will be our presenter today, and Sue Fisher, thank you, Sue. Sue Fisher is our emergency manager with Cal State Fullerton. And so today she's going to give you a history on how we came about with the management system and stuff, and then give you tips on what you need to know while you're doing your sheltering. I'm going to now turn this presentation over to Sue Fisher. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you very much. You can hear me okay? You got a thumbs up, wave? Yeah, there we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm just thrilled to be here today, I guess here, well, not here, but with you here. Mostly because this is an unprecedented time. We've never seen anything quite like this, quite frankly, and it's and the scientist in me is very excited about the kinds of things that we're learning and doing, and certainly not the negative ramifications of what's been happening. But just as an emergency manager, but as a scientist as well, to see the kinds of things that we are doing and what's successful and what's not. So I think particularly in what I do in my field, that this is one of those things that you oftentimes just look at every day and shake your head like, how can it possibly get worse, or how can we do whatever we're doing? It's really quite a process. So anyway, let me first say that in this presentation, I'm going to offer basically my professional knowledge about emergency management and how things work. But it's really not, the opinions, quite frankly, are mine and based on my own experiences. They're not Cal State Fullerton's, but the opinions are mine. But I really try to present information that I think is important, as well as to give you a little bit of background in terms of why we're doing these things. And I think for an awful lot of people looking at even the local, state, and federal response to this, you think, gosh, who's running this thing? How does this work? So I think that this presentation hopefully will clarify how that works, as you know, in a very large sense. But also give a little bit of context. And I love the history part of it, because there's so many things that have gotten us to where we are today. I think it's kind of important to bring that forward. And I think that with this very esteemed group here, I think that you'll probably appreciate that as well. So anyway, the opinions are mine. It's basically based on my research, hopefully some common sense, maybe a little bit of imagination, but hopefully you'll all find this helpful today. And with that, I'll get going with the presentation. And as Ellie said, if you've got questions, type them into the chat box, and at the end, I'll try to answer all of those. And then if we need to go back into a slide, if you want to refer to, I think I can do that. Pretty sure I can. So we can go back and look at slides if you have something in particular you want to talk about. But again, I am not the absolute authority. And if I don't mind being corrected, or if there's something that you think that's not right, call me out on it. I mean, this is a learning experience for all of us. And again, I very deeply appreciate being here today. So let me go on to our presentation and see if I can actually share my screen. Okay, Ellie, can you see that? Everybody? Okay, good.
Yes,
okay,
we can.
So, awesome. So in the presentation today, again, I think it's hopefully a bit of a snapshot through time, so that we get an idea of how all this is being played out in terms of like who's doing what for this crisis. So, oops, just like that. So what we're going to be covering today is looking at a history of disasters, because I think that it's a good setup for how we are where we are today. A little bit of history then of emergency management itself. And then I'm going to talk about how governments respond to disasters. And I think this is a key thing that an awful lot of people may have an idea of how it's supposed to work, but in fact, it might be very different in terms of how you think that either a local, state, or federal government responds to a disaster. And then a little bit about emergency management, because again, that's kind of my thing, and how that is interfaced with how we are dealing with the COVID-19 response. And then finally, just some tips that I have in terms of the things that I've read and I understand from the CDC and other health department authorities on what you should be doing and what you can't do. So first though, the key elements of emergency management, and quite frankly, this little wheel here guides everything that emergency management professionals do. Whoops, did that flip out? All right, you still there? This is the dynamic process that we're constantly in. If you look at disasters, and actually into the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about historically how an awful lot of these things have shaped our current way that we look at emergency management. So through the mitigation, prevention, that's how do we get rid of a hazard or how do we prevent it from happening? How do we lessen the effect? And then going into the preparedness phase, which hopefully many of you have done through my recommendations of how we prepare for all kinds of disasters, particularly earthquakes. I think I've done a few presentations on those. The response was obviously that's the phase we're in right now with our COVID-19. And then in the process, and recovery is one of those things you can kind of think of in an awful lot of ways, except for the actual response. A lot of these, the other three colors of this wheel are really spinning all the time. We are already thinking about how we can prevent and mitigate the next wave of what we see as another wave of flu season, and possibly with this COVID-19 again next year, how we're preparing for it. And again, we're already talking about the recovery process, which for this is unprecedented, particularly when we look at the economic situation. Okay, this is a little too far back in history, but if we think about emergency management, we might have been able to prevent this whole thing. But on the other hand, if we would have done that, maybe humans wouldn't be here either. So anyway, too far back. So, but let's go a little bit more recent. So if you look at the Egyptians, actually there were a lot of peoples around the world that were doing some pretty phenomenal things. But this happened to strike me as that just the salient point of what we do in emergency management, which is that whole preparedness mitigation phase. And I think if you think about, this is 1860, 1814 BC, that they had actually built a canal. And the architecture of this, for those architects out there, if you want to look this up, it's a phenomenal feat. He made us almost a 10-mile, 1 mile wide, or 10-mile long, not almost a mile wide canal to be built. And the basic control or reason for that is they were controlling flooding. So they were doing an awful lot of the mitigation. A lot of that area was seasonally flooding. And then through the preparation part of it, then they were creating a lake that they used for their area's farmland. So it sustained a population there for literally a very long time, for a century. So it was really quite a marvel, and certainly when we look back at preparation mitigation, that really falls into that category. Now, if we look more at historical events, and the reason that I brought this up is that I think that I don't think there was much in the way of emergency management being instituted here, but I think what's interesting is that it erupted in 79, witnessed by both of the younger and elder Plinies. But the reason that it was so impactful, and this should be one of our lessons we should tuck into our hat. There was a huge eruption in 600 BC in that area, in Mount Vesuvius, that created basically this area that was so ideal for living. All of that volcanic material that came out of the volcano, it created this very rich soil around the volcano because of the way that a lot of the eruptions had occurred. It created this perfect harbor. It was just this perfect place to live. Unfortunately, it meant then that by the time Pompeii had flourished or was flourishing, it was a few hundred years later, and it was on the side of a very active, very explosive volcano. So, and what's interesting about this is actually Pliny the Elder was a very revered statesman at that time. And when the eruption started, his nephew, Pliny the Younger, was looking at it and observing, both of them very stately people, very educated, really wanted to document everything. So a lot of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius actually came from Pliny the Younger. But anyway, his uncle, Pliny the Elder, then was very curious. He, of course, a scientist himself, he commissioned a ship to take him to the harbor so he was closer to the eruption. And then obviously that eventually became his undoing. But it's an interesting story to consider when we're thinking about today where we are placing people in harm's way. So Ben Franklin, coming a little bit more recent. So this is actually sort of the first time that we are actually establishing codes to deal with fires, because there were fires that were actually coming into the harbor there in Pennsylvania. And what they were finding is that if there was a ship that happened to have a fire, it very quickly moved on shore and were destroying a lot of buildings. So Franklin, seeing this, created the Union Fire Company, and that was sort of the original fire brigade that was completely run by volunteers. And that eventually led to building codes and fire insurance, what we are the beneficiaries of today. The Battle of Gettysburg. Well, you think, gosh, what does that have to do with emergency management? Well, for those of us who have actually gone through some fairly extensive training on leadership, and those of you, I bet in the audience, know this very well. If you study the battles and the things that went on, there are just some phenomenal lessons that were learned or should have been learned in the Battle of Gettysburg. But what's interesting for me is an emergency management aspect, and remember our circle there, the recovery part. This is really the first recorded example of an organized recovery in the United States. Now, before the Battle of Gettysburg, if you look at the city itself, it was this beautiful city. It was a thriving, very successful community. If you look at the areas of around it, it was very much agricultural, although about the time in the 1860s, nearly 60% of all people in the United States at that time, it was an agricultural community. So it's very largely agricultural, but they did have these cities dotted throughout the country, and Gettysburg was one of them. So there were, and this is important, that there were at the time, right before the battle, or the time leading up to the battle, there were a lot of resources actually in Gettysburg itself. And then the battle happened. So if you look at what happened there, I mean, besides the horrors of war itself and everything that happened, it was absolutely a public health crisis. So if you look at the data here on the left-hand side, so 3 days after the battle, this is what this in the area around Gettysburg looked like. So it was in the battles occurred, you know, because over the series of the 3 days, it was around 9 square miles. So what's remarkable about that then, so the battle has ended. There are almost 8,000 bodies laying in this 9 square miles. There are 27,000 people who are wounded. And because of the state of the federal government at that time, they had spent all of their money on the war itself. So there was no backup supplies. There weren't medical supplies. There was very little in the way of any medical expertise. And because that they had occupied Gettysburg before that, they had pretty much taken everything out of the city. So the city was left with nearly nothing. So what happened then, if you can imagine walking out the door of your house after a 3-day battle, and you're surrounded by literally thousands of bodies, and it's you know, if you think about it, it's over 1,000 corpses per acre, and then about 4,000 wounded people per acre right around the city itself. So it was really a remarkable feat that the citizenry, which ones were left, they were taking whatever they had there to be able to clear up this situation. It was just a remarkable feat that they were able to take care of it at all. Because if you can imagine all of these bodies rotting, and this is July, so we're warm season now. So we've got the situation where bodies are rotting in the field, and it was a huge crisis at that time. But it was that sort of beginning organized recovery. They really needed to clean this area up so that they could go on with their lives again. The Johnstown Flood is something that I find incredibly interesting. there was an earthen dam that they knew about, and there were some questions about its validity. And the reason that I put this up here, it's, gosh, I've lost my number on the number of people that actually died in this flood. It was a tremendous amount of water that came through this city, or through this town that was downriver from the dam. But what's interesting to me is there was one person who was at the he was on the railroad station, and I think I've got the story right. It's been a while since I've read about it, but nevertheless, he was actually sounding the train whistle. He was trying to tell people that something was coming. So undoubtedly that advanced warning, which is something that we know about right now when we think about California fires, it's advanced warning to tell people that something was going wrong and to take shelter. So if you think about it, really, with all of these things that are going on, what we need is some organization. And so that's where emergency management actually plays a pretty big role. And so at this point in time, we're going to take just a kind of a walk through a lot of events that have happened that get us to where we are today. And again, I think for those of us looking at how we are responding to disasters today, I think this gives us a good context of what has happened and kind of the bumps along the way that maybe were not the best thing that we could have done during this process. So if we think about the American Red Cross, and obviously we know about Clara Barton founding that in 1881, but what's interesting about that is that she had actually, she had witnessed an awful lot of what was happening, you know, not directly at Gettysburg, but she'd witnessed an awful lot of the injuries and the people dying in the fields because of those wars, the Civil War. So she had, subsequent to that, she had actually been traveling in Europe. And what she found is that there had been a businessman in Switzerland in 1863 who had actually made the same sort of observation, that he had seen all of these soldiers dying in the fields and thought, gosh, you know, these people they need some help. So he was actually the first one that created the Red Cross in Switzerland to have these systems of volunteers that would learn basic medical skills so that they could go out and actually help these people that who were injured and dying in the fields, or at least wounded in the fields, some eventually dying because of the wars. And what's interesting, I think, about that is that later helped set up the rules for treatment of prisoners of war, and also the Geneva Convention. So it's kind of an interesting bit of history that's associated with that. The next one, you think, well, you know, the Flood Control Act, I get the mitigation part of it. But there, to me, this is kind of the hook about flood control. So obviously in the first part of the 1900s, there's an awful lot of people now that are moving to these very rich floodplains around Mississippi and Ohio and a lot of other rivers. So the federal government gave the increased authority to the Army Corps of Engineers to build these flood control projects. Well, let's think about where our, a lot of the challenges that we have today then are because people are building homes in flood control areas. People are building homes in areas that are highly fire prone. People are building lots of buildings, and here we are in Southern California, on top of active faults, or at least known faults. So anyway, in this particular situation in 1917, the Army Corps of Engineers, even though they were controlling flooding, what it did allow people to start to do now is to actually build homes and make them actually quite vulnerable in these floodplains, because the flood control projects had some limitations, but again, it really opened up the way for people to start to build in areas where they had never built before because they always used to flood. So in 34, what's interesting about this is that now we are starting to look at some of the infrastructure for highways and bridges. So our transportation areas were actually being damaged by natural disasters. And so there was now federal funding to be able to address those for commerce in particular. now we're getting to more of the Disaster Relief Act of 1950. And basically, this is getting to basically hinting at what we're doing today, although it does bring up a precedent for how we actually address disasters in the federal government's assistance in disasters. So what this allows us to do then is the US president now can issue disaster declarations, and that's going to become important later. So now we can actually assist state and local governments when there is a disaster that happens. So kind of in addition to that, we in the United States created the Civil Defense Act in that same year, which now that added not just natural disasters, but also the the threat of nuclear war, which was, you know, pretty intense at that time, but it created a preparedness framework for minimizing those attacks. And then, of course, those of us in California should have seen this as an important aspect for us, which is the Office of Emergency Preparedness. That was sort of the beginnings then of emergency management in the United States in 1960, where we were the recipient here, particularly on the East Coast, of Hurricane Donna, Hurricane Carla, two very forceful hurricanes. And then also surprising probably to an awful lot of people in Montana that there was a 7.3 magnitude earthquake. And so the Office of Preparedness, Emergency Preparedness then was created to oversee the response for these natural disasters. So I think it's a kind of a funny corollary now to our original early in the century acts of having the Army Corps of Engineers build these flood control areas. And now, and what sort of ended up then, coincidentally, of allowing now people to build in these flood prone areas. So now there was legislation then to be able to provide some flood insurance to those that couldn't afford it. So the National Flood Insurance Program then basically was giving people in the ability to afford to build in flood prone areas. Then, of course, in 1979, that's probably one of the things that marks, I think, primarily the beginning of what we believe is like, this is the impactful emergency management response at the federal level. So in the 70s, there were so many different state and federal, state, and local entities that were all involved in how we're responding to disasters. And if you can imagine, this was a disaster in itself because it's a lot of different ways that people were structured. There were an awful lot of ways that they had used for communication, for example. And then in 1979, then FEMA was eventually created by President Carter to centralize those efforts. And I might want to add, also in the early 1970s, it was the California fire, gosh, what was it called then? Sorry, spacing right now. But anyway, in California, basically what would be the state fire entities decided that they were having problems in their own responses because I believe it's in Northern California where it became so obvious that there had been fires. And so they had these different fire engines that were reporting to fires, and they had different codes. They were speaking essentially different languages because of their codes. They were finding that they were getting either too much of one resource and not enough of another resource. And then they were finding that the way that they were responding couldn't allow several of these different fire engine companies to actually cooperatively respond to these fires. And so actually it was in California, yay California, we created a system that was called Incident Command System. And so we started this in California to be able to have a unified system of how we're responding to disasters. And we're going to talk some more about that later. But I think it's instructive to think in the early 70s, when all of this disorder was taking place, that California really was a leader. I think the entity was called Firescope, that actually tried to create some type of entity so that we could respond responsibly and we could be effective in that response as well. And then, of course, we're all quite familiar, sadly, because of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and that created the Oil Pollution Act. And so that was important because now it was a comprehensive plan for the prevention, liability, and compensation policies for all oil pollution in the U.S. navigable waters. That was followed in '92 by the Federal Response Plan. And what's important about this one is that it created now a systematic process for the coordinated delivery of federal assistance to address these effects. And, and that created the Robert T. Stafford Act. And that's especially important because that's essentially what we use today to be able to request federal assistance to natural disasters. And I might add, natural disasters under this particular description always in the past has meant hurricanes or earthquakes or fire or flooding or something like that. But because of our current situation, it actually now is clarified that it also includes pandemics. And of course, I think the final thing that really we're all very attuned to is on September 11th, 2001, because of the particular terrorist act that happened in New York City, then the Department of Homeland Security was created. And what's different about this is that even though there had been the act earlier about the nuclear strike back in the 50s that was of concern, now terrorism is really coming onto the radar for what we need to incorporate into emergency management responses. So it became truly the turning point for how we coordinate and advance emergency management in the United States. And now I've lost mine. There it is. Oops. Okay, so just as a reminder then, emergency management then includes all of these things. And what the key part of it then is that it's organized, it has a clear set of rules, we can communicate well, and the really important thing in my mind is the accountability part of it. So I'm going to, if I can get this to work, I have a little video to show you what maybe is not the model to use. So I'm going to switch it over real quick. And hopefully this will work.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
EDF's manage.
So that's literally one of my favorite videos. I wish that I could find a better resolution copy, but it was done, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, but it's oldie but a goodie, but I truly enjoyed that video. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. So anyway, that concept of herding cats, oftentimes I think that's what we've experienced even today for a lot of our responses. And I think one of the reasons that I really wanted to give this presentation is to clarify really how it does work in response to any kind of disaster. And obviously it doesn't always work perfectly, but I think that it's, oops. Yeah, there we go. important to understand how this all works. So anyway, the key part of all of these responses, quite frankly, is the incident command system. And remember, this is the system that was created in California through, I believe, the organization called FireScope. So the fire departments in California created a system. And the reason that it works so well are these 4 basic tenets. And if you think about it, it's common terminology. And one of the things that I didn't know until I started working about 10 years ago on the university, I started working in the police department, and they're constantly, you know, speaking in code, and I have no idea what a 293 or a 469, I don't know what all those things are, and quite frankly, I've not bothered to know, because I'm always thinking incident command. We need common terminology. And the thing that was surprising to me as well, and I guess I should have realized this, is the codes in one particular police department or fire department is not the same code system that's used in another. And so that's why it's extraordinarily important in the incident command system to have common terminology, rather than saying, I'm going to make up a number, a 492, rather than saying, I'm going to report back to the base. So the common language and the common terminology, the plain talk, is extraordinarily important for the communication piece. Another part of that is the manageable span of control. And what that means is that each person only reports to one person. So you only have one boss. That's really important. For those of you, you know, we've all worked before, and there's some people that think they should, you know, you report to multiple people. No, in ICS, it's only efficient if you have one person you report to. And then conversely to that, no leader then has more than 7 people report to them. So what that means, and 5 is kind of the ideal number, but you know, 7 is the absolute maximum. And the reason for that, again, they're looking at span of control. If you get many more people than that, it's very, very difficult to try to understand what they're all doing and to be able to coordinate what's going on. And that there's what we call a unity of command, which means that there is a single incident commander for each incident. Now, there can be incidents, and you can think of this, particularly if we're thinking of a fire, where there might be various police agencies, there might be various fire agencies that are responding, maybe social services. Now, there might be multiple agencies that are actually working together, but then they use a unified command, which basically means that they all get together in the room, but they come up with a single voice and a single speaker for that voice, so that they can have a single purpose and a single voice that's actually united and coordinated in their response. And then one of the other things that's really, really important about this is the whole incident command system is not a single size. If you want to have it very small and you just have an incident commander, for example, you want to bake a cake. You're your own incident commander, you're running everything. But if you're making 15 cakes, then you may need to employ other people to help you in that task. So you can expand and collapse that response as much as you need to. And that way you can make the best use of your personnel and equipment resources and use whatever you need. And then the important part of that is you reduce it or deactivate whatever you don't need. So you don't have people just standing around waiting to do something. You can actually deactivate or reduce the number of personnel so that you are using the best resources you have available. The ICS structure basically looks like this. So in every case, you have to have an incident commander. That is the person, at least initially, with the most knowledge about what's going on. Now, as the incident commander then looks over and says, gosh, this is a pretty big incident. I need to make sure that everyone remains safe. So they need to make sure that there's a safety officer there to look at the response. The public information officer is very important, particularly today, because we want to make sure that whatever information is going out about this incident is timely and accurate. And then your liaison officer is sometimes there, sometimes not, but that often will be that person who interfaces with other agencies outside this particular one. And then if you need to, then you can expand up to these 4 sections. So there's an operations section, and there's a chief, the head of that. The operations section, they do a lot of stuff. For your planning section, they're going to plan what is going to be done in the future. They're very good at looking kind of at the big picture. The logistics section then, they go out and get stuff for you. So if you need to have all of the ingredients for the cake, they're going to make sure that you have all those ingredients for the cake. And of course, your finance section, those are the individuals that look over the finance section for that particular response. So if you think about this, this literally can be applied to everything. It's absolutely used for any disaster, crisis events, big events, for example, at the university, and pretty much every university across the United States, they use them for graduation ceremonies. It's a very easy way of making sure that everything is done and it's coordinated. So absolutely, if you're looking at music festivals, any big events, air shows, pretty much any gatherings, and probably if you look deep enough into how weddings, birthday parties, any kind of events where you're getting together are coordinated, chances are that they're using some version of ICS, or might I add, they probably should. But the key thing about ICS is it is required. At a national level, quite frankly, they were looking at ICS and how applicable it was to pretty much all of these disaster responses. So now it is actually a requirement that it's called NIMS, the National Incident Management System, and now it applies to all jurisdictions. So all jurisdictions mean every city government, every entity. So for example, Cal State Fullerton is considered a special jurisdiction. Public and private entities, all jurisdictions, for example, even within private entities, for example, social service agencies, as well as something even like Disneyland, all of them need to use this approach. And the key thing about this too, it's all hazards, it's not any particular hazards, and the key thing, all people. So all people mean all people that are involved with that particular disaster. There's no parsing out of one group that has favoritism or priority over another. And then the other thing about NIMS is that it's really important that we're improving the response coordination between public-private entities. This is particularly important in these big areas where we have very large areas like earthquakes or fires, or as what we know today, COVID-19. And so in California then, it's our requirement that we have a standardized emergency management system. We have to use ICS. We have to coordinate between agencies. We actually have a state neutral aid system. And the operational concept just basically means that California is so big that we've divided it into 9 areas. And so it helps us just coordinate throughout the state. So this whole system of disaster response then always follows the same flow. There will be an incident initially, and then there's what we call the field response. That's the people very, very close to that incident that respond. If they are overwhelmed, they go to their emergency operations center, our local one. For that entity, they would reach out to the county, which gets pushed up to the state, which then gets pushed up to FEMA. So the specifics of that are really important, and I think it's important to understand the whole government emergency response is that basically every disaster response starts locally. That is the mantra for everyone. So we don't immediately blow things up to FEMA. There's actually a process. So in this particular case, for the COVID, we have local cities that are responding. And of course, this is immediately overwhelming us. So the local cities then, they would ask Orange County Emergency Operations Center to help them. So then when the Orange County EOC, they need more resources, the first thing that is done is a local emergency is declared. And that's key to being able to then request help from the State Emergency Operations Center, which in this case is our California Operation of Emergency Services operational area. So now when that state EOC needs more resources, then a state emergency is declared. Once that is declared, then they can request a federal declared emergency. And only at this time, and this is what's key to understand, is that people think, oh, FEMA should rush right in and help things, but that's not the process. If you look at the steps here on this screen, this always has to happen. And this is going to become important in an issue I'm going to bring up later. FEMA can offer assistance, but it can't help with that official request from the state or the jurisdiction itself. So when we're looking at emergency management and the whole response to our current COVID-19 situation, basically this is what's going on. You may have been able to see some of these things go on as you're looking at newspaper, just reading the news. A lot of this we've seen, you know, they were tracking diseases when the incidences of COVID-19 were first coming to Orange County. The Orange County Healthcare Agency was very, very proactive and very busy tracking those cases. And of course, you probably knew this as well. They were very interested in finding out who that person might have exposed. At some point in time, quite frankly, they stopped the tracking because the number of people that were infected and the number of people that were potentially infected were so huge, they just quite frankly they did not have the personnel or the ability to track could have been exposed. Then they're going to modes where they are informing the people, and then quite frankly, that's when we're going into the mode of the washing hands, the social distancing, and those kinds of things. So the other part of that, a really key part of that, is the communication and education that has to take place. And again, this is all under the guise of what we do in emergency management and our response. And so communication about this is really critical. And if you think this is a really big part of any kind of disaster, people want to know, number one, what is going on? And number two, what am I supposed to do? And so the communication and education becomes really, really critical for any disaster, but particularly for this one, because it's through that communication and education that we're actually trying to stop the continuation of this particular disaster, which in our case is the further infection. A part of the emergency management planning is also readying the medical facility. So you may or may not have been on the Orange County Healthcare website, but if you look at that, you can see all of the operations that have been done to prepare medical facilities. They're looking at what is their surge capacity, and basically that means what is their top capacity if we are starting to get the number of infections and the number of very severe infections and those that need respirators. You know, what capacity do all the medical facilities have? And so it was a huge, huge undertaking on the part of all of the hospitals and medical facilities to be able to make a determination. What people do they have? What equipment do they have? What supplies do they have? What really is their capacity if we were to have gotten the surge that has been predicted, that fortunately through our actions we've not seen yet, but you know, I don't want to say the end is over because it's not. They need to make sure that they order supplies, and of course, I'm sure that you've all heard about, you know, the face covering, specifically the N95s. The N95s, just to clarify, those are the ones that are specifically for medical and hospital facilities, medical personnel, your first line responders. Those are the people that could have very close contact with someone who's infected. So the N95 is the only face covering. I don't even want to call it face covering. It is the only mask that has a pretty high assurity that a disease cannot be transmitted to the person wearing an N95 mask. The N95 stands for the 95% of particulates over 0.3 micron that can actually be respirated by wearing that mask. So it's really important that we understand that the N95 are for those medical personnel and the first responders who could be or are in very close contact with those who are infected. Okay, and then of course the other supplies we know about: gloves and the respirators, the ventilators rather. Those are all supplies that people want. A lot of these medical facilities want, and so it's the responsibility then of the emergency managers and the organization in Orange County to be able to understand who needs them, and then to get those supplies and to be able to send those out to those in most need. And of course, we know that they're in short supply, so it's been a very, very difficult process to be able to send those supplies to those that are in the greatest need. And then again, the communication to the public is you know, not only the communication within, but also the communication to the public is very, very clear in telling them what we want them to do. And of course, the other the other important point for emergency management then is that they are that coordination point between all the other jurisdictions in the county as well as the state. So the real challenges to the COVID-19 in our response is that, you know, this is the first pandemic in over 100 years. Of course, there was the Spanish flu in the early 1900s, but obviously we know that there's huge differences in that. Number one, people did not travel as much 100 years ago as they do now. The population in a lot of these cities are much greater now than they were 100 years ago. So even though there's somewhat of the lesson learned about disease in terms of how it's communicated, nevertheless, there's so many differences that we can say, yes, they're both pandemics, but in many ways they're very different. I think the other challenge is that unlike a hurricane or fire, you can't see this particular hazard. So it makes it difficult for people to believe that the hazard exists when you can't see it in front of you. And then the kind of responses that we have been able to mount for fires, floods, earthquakes, that's not the kind of response we're doing now. It's very, very different. And then the other thing that's been a challenge for emergency managers as well is that, for example, the decisions, at least in the county level, or even at the state level, sometimes they are made for us. So there was a federal request to shelter in place. There is a state shelter in place. There is a county shelter in place. So sometimes the decisions are made for you, which for the best of everyone, but oftentimes it does change the game because typically, again, remember that saying a few slides back that all the local responses to disasters or all response to disasters start locally. And that's true here, but in this particular case, sometimes if you have a state declaration of something that is going to overlap or basically guide your decision making and maybe even make that decision for you. And the other thing that makes this really difficult is the success of how we end up at the end of this road for our COVID-19 is depending on citizenry compliance. Whereas if you think about, for example, a fire, the success of that fire really depends on our first responders, right? Who can get people out there and get them evacuated? Who can get those fire engines out there quickly? Who can get the helicopters or whatever it is that goes out there to fight that fire? It depends on these other entities to be able to find success in it. Where this particular one, it depends on us. And that's what's very, very difficult and challenging about our response to the COVID-19. And the other thing too, this is a very long event. Now, if we look at, and I'm sure if my parents were still alive today, they would go, well, I remember back in the, we had the Great Depression. That was a very long event too, but in some ways probably not comparable. But still, I think today in our very fast-paced world where, every moment of every day, we've got to get on social media or we have to get on our electronic devices and know what's going on. This seems like a very, very long event. We have been in our own stay-at-home orders now since March 16th. And so it's been over a month. So for an awful lot of people, this is an interminably long time. So it makes it very different though, because emergency management, again, typically is for that relatively short period of time, but now this is going on for weeks and weeks, and it makes it a very different challenge for emergency management. So generally speaking, things work best when we can do planning and preparation. Now again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but if you think about the planning and preparation for a pandemic, a pandemic has been floating around there in terms of something that we will experience at some point in time for decades. But I think that, I'll just throw it out there. I think particularly at the federal level that there has not been the serious attention paid to this, even though that there are a lot of voices out there and there's a lot of studies that talk about something that I think is very, very important. And that's the fact that we are now encroaching on areas of wilderness and places where those microorganisms and those animals were never evolutionarily meant to interact with humans, nor us with them. And so we are marching into brand new territory now where we are exposing and intersecting these things at a biological level that were never meant to intersect one another. So I think that should have been the cautionary tale that many scientists have been throwing up for some time. And I think it works best when we have a diverse group of experts and stakeholders, because no one's going to have like the answer. But I think if you have a very diverse group that brings in these various aspects, and you know, we know this, and I'm sure you know that at OLLI, when you have a diverse group of people, a lot of different ideas come together, that's when you're going to get a very clear picture and nothing gets forgotten or ignored. And I think the other thing that is, you need to make sure that you are concentrating on the needs of the people, the structures, the environment, and they're held above political imaging. And enough about that. And then I think the other really important thing, and I can say this on behalf of being an emergency management professional myself, that we have a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise, and all of this works best. And I think they do this actually really well at the Orange County level. They do a very good job of valuing and listening to their emergency management professionals. But I think the other thing too is that it's really important that if we need to have lessons learned and we document them, and then we make sure that we follow up on them, because this is not for me, but I've heard this several times before, that we are going to see COVID-19 again in this next flu season. So we should really make sure that we're paying attention now and learning from them and act on how we can prepare for it next season. So the things obviously that don't work well, if there are plans that you don't have or you don't follow them, remember how important ICS is. I think because it was such an extraordinary event, that there are some entities out there that they, rather than using what's in place, they go, oh my gosh, let's have a committee. And committees are valuable for some things, but it shouldn't replace the kind of structure that's set up in emergency management through ICS. The other thing that they've found is that a lot of people are not trained in emergency response, or maybe I should say emergency management principles, because I think you don't have to be an expert, but understanding the principles of those I think are important. Making sure you got your subject matter experts. I cannot tell you how excited I get when I see Dr. Fuji. No, that's not it. Sorry, I've just spaced on his name. Is it Dr. Fuji? Somebody nod, no?
Fauci.
Fauci, thank you. I was close. Dr. Fauci gets up, just an incredible wealth of information, very calm. I mean, when he speaks, people listen, and that's extraordinarily important, that we have someone up there standing at a national level to say, this is what's going on, and he's got decades of really solid experience and expertise behind him. And that things that don't work well, again, not supporting the programs that we know work, and that we're not using the expertise that should be out there. So I just want to throw this up because this is important, because an awful lot of people were really, really hard on FEMA and the whole response for Hurricane Katrina. And I'm sure that no one can forget those images of those people packed into that stadium, and the kind of things that happened afterwards, where people were forced to live for some time in those moldy homes, and it was just a horrible, horrible response. So obviously 2005 killed 1,800 people, although I would say that it probably, that number, generally speaking, is going to be higher simply because of the health effects it inflicted on many of the people that did survive, and caused $100 billion in damages. So at the federal level, and there are a lot of people that blamed FEMA for this, but yeah, FEMA should take some of the blame. However, it's kind of a mixed bag. Definitely there were key federal officials that they did not give the right information, and or they really didn't understand how the system worked. There were plenty of lessons to be learned from earlier storms, particularly in that area of the country, but they were again, if you've got an after action report and you fill it out and say, this one didn't work, but this will, and that they're not heeding those, and those are extraordinarily important. Communication breakdown, but this was not just the federal. I mean, this was at the local, state levels as well. Supplies were uncoordinated. There were like literally, there was either way too much or way too little or none. There were literally heaps, and I mean mountains of clothes and just stuff that people either couldn't use or there was no way to get it to them, or there would be 12 or 15 trucks of water, but no place to actually store them or to disseminate all of those, bottles of water. Or there were like, I forget how many, it was a huge number of trailers that were sent down to New Orleans to be able to house some people. But because it couldn't be coordinated, which gets into the second part. The regulations were in conflict with the needed actions. So they had these thousands of mobile homes, but because of the regulations, according to the federal regulations, they could not put them on floodplains. Well, hello, all of that area is a floodplain, so they weren't able to use them. So a lot of the state and federal indecision caused an awful lot of the horrors that happened in Hurricane Katrina. And then, of course, there was the no system of control, which led to an awful lot of fraud and abuse of aid along the way. So, take-home lesson. Yeah, that's what I think I look like. I've always tried to sell myself as that's what I look like. But really, for all of us, at every level, whether it's personal, in your house, in your neighborhood, in your community, going up to a city level, within your county, all the way up, it is a team effort to be able to get through any of these things. Leadership is key, and again, that goes from yourself taking leadership to your house, to your neighborhood, to your city, on up. Leadership is key to making those responses work and work well. And I think leadership encompasses a lot of things. I've studied a lot of leadership models over the year, and to me, the most important leadership qualities are being able to listen to others and act on that. Is that leadership is not easy, and I think for emergency management, this becomes particularly difficult because oftentimes emergency managers will try to tell their administrators, it's like, yeah, you can't do this because this is the consequence, but oftentimes that does not get done because unfortunately, there are political agendas out there, and oftentimes they're in direct conflict with what emergency managers really have experienced and believe should be the primary efforts that we should be doing. So emergency managers, of course, are marvelous, I think. But we have a lot to offer, and if you know someone, emergency manager out there, give them a shout out that we're behind the lines. We are not the people usually in front of the camera, or that we get the star at the end of the process. But we certainly do have an awful lot of expertise and really want the best outcome for everything. So what can I do, or what can you do? What can we do? Maybe I should have had that. What can we do? We need to, number one, listen to our public health agencies. That's where your local expertise lies. Make sure you listen to them. I have seen an enormous amount of crazy stuff out there. So make sure that if you're going to act on something, make sure that you go to your local public health, go to the CDC, go to those entities that you know are reliable and they're fact-checked. So it's really, really key that you do that, because again, there's some I think in every disaster, there's always someone out there to prey upon you. And I've already got a couple of calls from, I see you're eligible for assistance. Why don't you call me and provide this information? It's astonishing, how quickly that those vultures start circling as soon as a disaster occurs. This is important. Face coverings, they do not protect you. That's super, super important. It doesn't mean you should not use one, but this is what they're for. They're used to protect those around you if you're infected. The key part about that, and this is what's somewhat insidious about this COVID-19, is that you can be infected and actually multiply those viruses, spew those viruses out of your mouth as you speak, not so much as you breathe, but certainly as you speak, if you cough, if you sneeze. And you can be infected for about 14 days before you really start showing symptoms. So it's incredibly important that when you go out that you wear those. But again, it's the kind of thing that everyone needs to wear those. So that's why these face covering Well, they haven't been mandated in our county. They have in others. Riverside has mandated it. LA County has mandated it. I'd be surprised if Orange County does not mandate face coverings. But the whole idea is that you're protecting one another. So I would suggest highly, if you have to go out, you wear them. But again, along with the face coverings, it sets at least 6 foot distance from others. Wear gloves if you want to, but remember, wearing gloves just means that you now have an outside pair of skin, and you can still transmit viruses onto the outside of your gloves and to other things. So just make sure that you're aware that gloves protect your hands, but then you need to discard those gloves before you touch anything either on yourself or in your house. Oh, I've got stay at home. Stay at home orders are absolutely necessary to stop the infection. So, you know, people going to the park and going out and doing things, they're really not helping to stop the infection. So I know that we all have to go out to get groceries or go to the pharmacy or whatever it is that we have to do, but those should be very quick. Know what you need to do. You go in, you go out. When you're out there, keep your social distancing. Make sure you wear a face covering. You don't have to be militant about it, but if someone is not wearing a face covering, you know, kindly suggest that they do. It's the protection of everyone. You can make one super easy with a bandana. You fold it 4 times, slip a couple hair ties on the end, fold the ends over, and you can hook the hair ties over your ears. There's a bunch of stuff online to do it. So it doesn't have to be complicated. They are just meant to catch all of those droplets that come out of your mouth as you speak or as you cough, and those droplets then that potentially could be filled with viruses are now caught onto that fabric. It can't stop an individual virus particle itself because they're tiny, but it absolutely will help reduce the number of virus particles that actually come from your mouth if you're infected. So you don't have to be paranoid, but just be aware of what you touch when you go outside. So I keep some wet wipes in my car. So if I have to leave the car as soon as I get in, I make sure that I wipe off my keys. If I've touched my wallet, I wipe off my wallet. I wipe off my hands. I wipe off my steering wheel. I wipe off the handle of my car. And then if I have my mask on, I leave that in my car. Because after about 3 days, any of these viruses, you know, 3 days is going to be on the outside. They're not going to exist anymore. They're not viable after about, well, it could be literally hours, but I give the 3-day rule to give it some extra cushion. I just leave it in my car because I'm not out very often. I'm maybe out once a week, if that. So after 2-3 days, everything's going to be no longer active on it, so I can reuse my mask. And remember, plain soap is what's going to kill viruses and bacteria. It doesn't have to be plain. I'm a big person that does not like antibacterial soaps, mostly because the ingredient they put in these antibacterial soaps is not good for the environment, and in some cases can actually cause antibiotic resistance to some bacteria. So I highly recommend not using it because it's really not that much more effective in any way other than plain soap. Plain soap is going to kill whatever virus and bacteria is around. And then of course, washing your hands often, even within your own house. If you have to touch your mouth or face, wash your hands again. And then kind of at this point in time, we should be starting to train ourselves not to touch our mouth and nose, because that's probably how an awful lot of the numbers go up just in normal flu season. So this is kind of a new starting point for many of us. And there's a lot of things that we can do. But I think at this point in time, there's one more slide I think I have up here, maybe. Ellie, I'm sure you'll be able to have this available for everyone. I love to read about disasters. These are what I've read all of these books except for the last one. The last one was recommended to me, but I haven't read it yet. But the others I love. I love anything by David McCullough, quite frankly. But if you want to get a very, very interesting perspective on disasters, the big one by Lucy Jones. That's Dr. Lucy Jones, by the way, from Caltech. Just fascinating story. So great stories out there, and I'm sure there's a bunch more. And I'm going to open up for questions.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to ask Bill Riley to monitor the list and stuff of the questions. There are some questions that are in the chat box already. So I'm going to ask Sue to go ahead and click on her chat box. Basically ask the question out loud first so that everybody can hear and then answer it. And I can't see if somebody sent it privately to you, so I don't know how many questions you have in your box.
I have, oh, that's a good question. Do you think it necessary to wash everything that comes into the house, mail, food container, boxes? So I'll answer that first, and then there's another question after that. There's lots of videos out there that you can see. I would just caution. I would use caution. This is what I do. I worked in a research lab for a number of years, and I've done sterile techniques. So I go into lab brain mode, I guess, when I bring something inside. So we actually have a gas stove. So any bag or anything that comes in from the outside, it either gets set on the floor in front of the stove or it gets placed on the stove itself over the grids where the gas burners are. And so we're very careful. We take everything out of the bag, and then we have a very large sink so that we set it down into the sink, and then we pull things out and put it onto basically a towel. I'm of the opinion that I don't envision under any circumstances these large pools of viruses anywhere on any of these objects. And if you think about it, if it's an object that's been sitting, again, more than probably a few hours to a couple of days, the virus particles that are going to be on that are not going to be viable anymore. So if it's been sitting for a while, it's pretty good. So what I do though is I have a fairly large hand towel, and I dunk it in water and soap, and then anything I have worry about, I'll wipe it off. But if there are things that I don't need within the next 2 or 3 days, I set it on my back shelf and I just leave it, and then after 2-3 days I put it away. The same thing, I use reusable bags, and I know there's some places that don't allow you to use them, but so far I have. You have to bag your own, but all of those bags that I bring in, then I put in a back room in my house. And again, after 3 days or whenever I remember it, then I fold up the bags and put them away. So time is one of the elements that can help you. Just be very careful if you really want to wash things. A lot of people are very fastidiously washing their fruits and vegetables. But again, if you think about that kind of 2 to 3 day rule, it's going to sit for that long and you're not going to have to worry. But if you're really concerned about it, use a very, very dilute, just plain soap solution, rinse them off really, really well. Again, it doesn't really take much to clean those off, but use common sense, but I don't think you have to like scrub anything. So again, any of those food containers and stuff, I make sure they're in a sacred place, or okay, we'll call it sacred place, on my stove. I leave that, and then just a quick flick of all of those burners, it's going to burn off anything that's going to be placed there. So you might want to use that technique. Again, not be paranoid, but just kind of think about where that can be, and then again, wiping off your countertops and the floor where those bags might have set, washing your hands, and you should be good. And then there was another question about disinfectants. Again, plain soap is really your best disinfectant for pretty much everything. Soap and water. I have a whole stack of old towels, like little hand towels and hand face cloths, and I use that for everything. I soap and water. I wipe off everything. I wipe my hands. So I mean, to me, soap is your best thing. I don't like a lot of spray disinfectants, mostly because they have a lot of chemicals, and I really don't want to breathe those into my lungs. So I'd be very, very careful with spray disinfectants. But again, that's just from more general health and safety. And then how well supplied are Orange County medical facilities? Medical facilities are doing okay. But again, if you're hearing people getting, that are ordering N95s just to go out and shopping, I wish they wouldn't do that. We really need our N95 supplies for our the people that are actually in the medical facilities. And then, will my slides be available? Ellie, you can answer that. The slides will be available. I'd be more than
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'll get the slides from from Sue, and then I will have our folks basically post them. So for your
Okay.
view, okay?
It says, does vinegar disinfect? Vinegar, I would leave vinegar for two things. One, salads, and also for if you've got a buildup of that white scum from your gosh, spacing today. That white buildup on your the calcium buildup on your chrome somewhere around your sink. Vinegar is great for that, but it's not really a disinfectant. It doesn't have a high enough acidity by itself really to be very effective. If you want the ultimate disinfectant though, that's bleach. But again, be very careful with bleach. You don't want to mix it with other things. It only takes a tiny drop in like a couple of drops in a gallon of water to be very effective. I use it mostly if I'm going to do a load of towels. And there might be any mildew, I use it for that. There's a few things I use bleach for, but I use it very, very carefully.
We've got a couple of hands up.
Oh, hands. Where do I see hands? Ellie, do you see hands? Where's my hands?
Yes, Elizabeth Oates.
So Elizabeth Oates, you want to go
Oh, there
ahead
you
and
are.
ask your question?
Do you want to click that, Ellie?
Okay. Hello?
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Sue. Thank you so much for your lecture today and our talk or sharing. It was just really great.
Okay.
I have, well, two quick things. First is another resource for the Johnstown Flood. And this is actually written by our son, Michael Stephen Oates. And it's called Wade in the Water. And it's available on Amazon.
Wade in the Water? That's awesome.
And it is it's the story of the Johnstown Flood told through the eyes of a father and a son, basically. So it's, but within it, based on the Johnstown Flood, he added a few things here and there, I'm sure, but it is very, it's historical fiction, and it puts you right in the heart of the matter. So I think there were something like 30,000 people that lost their lives during that, which is amazing. And secondly, I just have to see what the rest of your t-shirt says. Emergency manager, because freaking awesome is not an official job title, okay? That's great.
Okay, Warren Wilson had a question.
Yes, it seems to me we have two big emergencies. We have the virus and we have the economy. And emergency management, I guess, has to somewhat, deal with both. And I mean, then I'm also putting it over to a problem that we've been working on for years with no resolution, which is homelessness. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're completely spot on. And I think that this is where it's very difficult for those of us in emergency management to really deal with this, is because we are telling people that the only way you're going to get rid of the spread of infection is to stay home. And obviously that has a direct impact on the economy. And then you get, the leaders of the county, the cities, the state, understanding that the financial impact has in some ways, not equally, but a different way, that it's affecting the lives of people as well. So it's oftentimes a balancing game. And I have to say, I have to give a lot of kudos to Gavin Newsom, who's really kind of holding that line going, we need to deal with this thing, because the hard part about it is that those of us in emergency management and a lot of those infectious disease people, we know that we have to stop this, because otherwise, if we just give a little dip, it's going to come up again, and then it's going to come back and really bite us again, and possibly in more insidious ways. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act, and that's the hard part of waiting until we believe that we get to that point where we can restart some things again, where we can start putting people back out there. And I'm sure you guys have seen the protests around, I guess there was one in Huntington Beach yesterday. They've been in Michigan, they've been all around the country. People are out there, they want to get back outside again. It's like, yeah, we know, but it's very, very difficult. And I think for some people politically, it's been really, really hard to make those decisions, even though they're the decisions in the much longer run, I think we're going to have to make. And with regards to homelessness, that's been especially challenging because we're trying, as emergency managers, we're looking at the aspect of trying to keep people safe. So we've got people who were in hospitals, taking up hospital space. They were in critical condition. Well, now they've recovered to the point where they can be maybe not in that critical care setting, but they need to be in some sort of setting. So we're trying to find that kind of intermediate housing for them so that they're somewhat isolated, but they're still able to recover. And then you get kind of conjointly to that saying, well, we have this very vulnerable population who's already living on the street. They meet the conditions of being vulnerable medically. They're vulnerable being over 65, although many of us would say over 65 is not a vulnerability. That now some people are saying, well, you didn't take care of the homeless before. Why are you trying to take care of them now? And those are causing some, quite frankly, some very difficult discussions and some issues that make it hard to try to say, well, I'm not really trying to favor one entity over another, but yet it kind of comes out that way. So I think that they're very, very difficult problems to solve, and it does. It's in direct conflict with trying to deal with, the economy, and then we've got a homeless situation, and then we've got this infection out here that's going through everyone. It's regardless of what economy or age they are. So it's a huge, huge issue, and I think it's something that we will be grappling with for some time.